Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
Okay, so I'd like to take a couple minutes, at least the opening portion of our show. I'm not sure how long we'll stay on this topic, but I do want to, we do want to start off with a reiteration, and then perhaps maybe a little bit more of a follow up on what we discussed at the end of our show last week, which was we started talking about the more about the Committee for the Present Danger China, the CPD, the newest iteration of this Cold War era organization that had been started and restarted at certain times during the Cold War era and has now come back as specifically to combat China, set up within like a year of the outbreak of the COVID-19 coronavirus, which is now there's serious attempts to blame this on the Chinese government, basically saying this started out of the province of Wuhan in China, and that the Chinese government deliberately tried to did nothing. Number one, did nothing to stop the spread, and number two, actually deliberately colluded with certain organizations, particularly say the World Health Organization, and that by extension brings in all of the different um, it's enemies or designated enemies of like this entire what we know as conspiracy culture, what I've called like the Mecca Mecha alliance, where it's just basically everybody under the sun who is seen as like a left wing, who is seen as left wing, is now culpable in this along with the Chinese, and that this was just a Chinese bioweapon to destroy the American economy and destroy our sitting president. So we ended with the conversation about this. CPD with China, which has taken the lead at pushing this narrative, and we discussed the combination of Zionist hawks, neocon, Bush era propagandists, and then even going back prior to that with Cold War propaganda, going back at least to the 1980s, 70s and 80s generation. Certainly the Richard Perle nest, as we have identified with people like Frank Gaffney, who's right in the center of this CPD China intrigue. And we had mentioned an article, and I had briefly done a little bit of summarizing of an article written in The Nation magazine in August of 2002 titled, and Jeremy, perhaps you could give the full title since it's in front of you right now.
Sure. It is, and I'm for once, very rarely, I'm going to be muting when you're talking because I got jackhammering going on the street. So I just wanted to let that be known. Okay, so this is titled The Men from Jinsa and CSP from September 2nd, 2002. The underline is they want not just the U.S. invasion of Iraq, but quote-unquote total war against Arab regimes by Jason Vest. And it's published, the data published is said to be August 15th, 2002.
Yes, and that would be within, I believe, within a few weeks of the first, of really, I think, when Cheney took the initiative of kind of leading the administration hardline response to really, really upping the ante in terms of the public discourse on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, and that, of course, coinciding with Iraq being supportive of terrorism, including the people who, we were told attacked us on September 11th. And so, an interesting time for this article to come out just before I think the real serious ramping up of propaganda from a public media oriented perspective began, which I would want to pinpoint as being the end of August, beginning of September 2002, and perhaps my timeline's not entirely right on that, but that's where I kind of have pinpointed that as being. But anyway, digressing, we talked about this
Well,
article.
Greg, what's interesting is going back to actually the show, the antidote that we did after we came back from Washington D.C. last summer, where we had seen this film that depicted the whistleblower of the GCHQ, the British NSA, that a lot of it were actually Catherine Gunn. And that was very interesting because we also then were beginning to read through this article by Johnny Vedmore, and that he then followed up that had to do with this exact time period and what Epstein was doing in England during this exact time period. I'm pretty sure. I think it was like either August or into the fall of 2002. and Epstein is in a countryside manor, sort of fairly close outside of GCHQ, actually in the country near where all of these estates of these prominent and wealthy people, scions of the British society, were. And meanwhile, he had gone there, it looks like, with this apparent Israeli intelligence operative, Nicole Junkerman, who Johnny Vedmore had gone through the flight manifests of the Epstein, the infamous quote-unquote Lolita Express, and that these were some very rare flights where there was only one other person who was named on the manifest, on the flight manifest, other than Epstein himself, and it was with these Nicole Junkerman. And she has a very interesting background, but what Vedmore began to put forth was that she had been at the epicenter of this then fairly recent move, and that we're just talking about, last year, really. I think he was reporting on what was going on in the UK health data management system at that point, and that Nicole Junkerman was in the epicenter of a move by a contractor, an outside contractor, to basically insert themselves to the center of the health data of all of the citizens of the United Kingdom. And of course, in the background there is Israeli intelligence, and which is, of course, also what's going on with Epstein. And we will touch a little bit more on that, maybe just down the road in the show a little bit, in terms of this recent reporting by Whitney Webb based on her conversations with one of the earliest Epstein victims who spoke out, Maria Farmer, talking basically naming, here's the punchline, naming Wexner, Leslie Wexner, as what she called the head of the snake in the United States, and basically recognized as running this Epstein operation that Epstein and Maxwell reported to Wexner on basically up through, as we already know, via some of the reporting that Whitney Webb has done, formerly Zev Shalev, in relationship to really Ari Ben Menashe and other Israeli intelligence potentially contacts, that it was an Israeli military intelligence operation, this Epstein network. And Maria Farmer, in her interview with Whitney Webb, puts Wexner at the top of that in terms of the United States, i.e. this sort of Sionim pyramid in relationship to this specific operation in the United States was Wexner. But in the background there, the other punchline is that it was the Rothschild network, and that is being alleged also that who really ultimately guards this, and it makes a lot of sense in relationship to the Rothschild background, in relationship to the origins of the Israeli state, and all of those deep historical aspects that would come into focus. But I just wanted to point that out, that what we were seeing in the same time as this run-up to the war in Iraq, and once again, let's remember the Wexner report, right? Wexner is hiring one of the Finkelstein's kids, one of Finky's kids, Arthur Finkelstein's kids, Frank Luntz, the alleged Republican pollster. He's really a framer. He's really a PR guy or a high level.
Who I one time had the privilege, long before I understood any of the anything that these kind of people represent. I once had the quote unquote privilege of hearing speak at an Amway conference once. So.
Yes, very interesting. And so he is this kind of guy, basically, somewhere in between a raw motivational speaker and a pollster. And so it was also interesting, too, in that Dole Institute event that I've spoken about a few times, in the transition after the 2016 election, where they had representatives of the corporate mainstream media, including New York Times and CNN. Actually, and the reporter at CNN was the same one who dropped the Bernie told Elizabeth Warren story that he didn't believe a woman could be president, or something like that.
Right, in perfect symmetry with Project Veritas coming out with Sanders' staffer threatening riots in Milwaukee. So
good point. And so at that event, which was a sort of a wrap-up, done as a wrap-up of the 2016 election, the panel of the Trump people, of course, had Michael Glassner, who we've talked about a lot, who's a key operative in the background here, all the way through from his work at the Port Authority under Michael under Louis Eisenberg, and coming also in relationship to Southwest APAC, but also involved with the parent company of Genie Energy in that whole relationship to who's on the board of Genie Energy in relationship to the Golan Heights, the clean break dirty war in Syria. And so that's a key guy. But then the other representative was John McLaughlin, who was this alleged Trump pollster, another Finky kids, Finkelstein's one of his, mentees of some sort. And he had come to the Trump campaign directly, literally in Israel, working for Benjamin Netanyahu, allegedly as a pollster again. Okay, and so of course, you look back at who Arthur Finkelstein was. What did he do? And what he did was he wasn't doing polling for the sake of finding out what people think. No, the poll in that whole network is actually a way of shaping thought. And McLaughlin ultimately was the only guy who even said anything in relationship to me asking whether the American people in the recent election had basically not really had an election, but just had a selection between two people apparently compromised at the highest levels by an apparent Israeli intelligence operation via Epstein. And McLaughlin was the only one who finally spoke up and said, none of what you said is true, okay? So I just wanted to point that out. I thought that was interesting because Wexner, this big deal with Wexner, of course, is that during this time here, right, this is the key moments, right, from the summer of 2002 into the spring of 2003. And so you have all of these moving parts here, which includes Epstein and Nicole Junkerman, for some reason set up in England. There was the reporting that there was U.S. senators there with them, and then the Senate comes back and makes key votes or decisions about the upcoming apparent war in Iraq. And then in the spring of 2003, Wexner is hiring Frank Luntz in order to run he's going to take the pulse basically, and it's going to be a recommendation of how to sell the launched Iraq war to the American people, obviously in anticipation of the reporting coming out of casualties on all sides. And then, and how to basically couch the invasion, the illegal war crime invasion of Iraq as somehow in American interest, not in Israeli interests. That was really the whole thing. And Wexner was leading the way in all of that. And so this Epstein network, Wexner behind it, and then, of course, overlords behind it, that it begins to become crucial and needs to be seen as at the very epicenter of the actual where the rubber meets the road in terms of hard-nosed politics around crimes as massive as the war in Iraq. So I just wanted to put all of that out there.
Well, thank you for doing that, and thanks for reiterating that history. And I think we will need to eventually at some point go back and revisit this whole topic of Nicole Junkerman as being one of the I guess maybe in some ways you might call her an unsung unhero of the Jeffrey Epstein saga that continues to be ongoing. Unsung unhero. Maybe we should get copyrights for that term. Maybe we should look into that. But it raises a lot of other questions regarding even getting into Nicole Junkerman's relationship with the Blatter family, that of course being the family of Sepp Blatter and FIFA, and relationships that are questionable to say the least with Russia and also with Saudi Arabia and related to the Qatar World Cup of a few years ago. And then also even questions of her involvement with the British healthcare system and possibly post-Brexit Britain and the city of London and the types of high finance that are represented there, that I think there is certainly a lot of overlap when it comes to things, to very pro-Israel nexus as it relates to things such as Britain being free of a European Union that's seen laughably since the EU does basically support everything Israel does, much like the U.S. Neoliberal establishment does, but not enough for the liking of someone like the real, extremist, settlement types that are out there and all that stuff. The apocalyptic types who just want Israel to run everything, basically. But and so there's some interesting more threads that need to be looked into and uncovered with that. And so that's something for future topic. I'm glad you brought that up with relation to the centering of the Epstein network and so many.
Greg, I just found this thing, and I will include this in our links so people can go through the whole thread, but I just want to read one tweet from that thread, or two tweets from the thread of Johnny Vedmore from July of 2019, right after he'd published this original article. Johnny Vedmore says, quote, "I'm still hunting for Jeffrey Epstein and Nicole Junkerman's location in the UK on 1st September 2002. Is it a coincidence that it was Alan Dershowitz's birthday? Junkerman had graduated Harvard, Dershowitz was teaching law at Harvard, and Epstein was about to donate to Harvard. Quote, Nicole runs NJF Holdings based in London and has collaborated on investments with Silicon Valley personalities such as Eric Schmidt, Google, or Peter Thiel, PayPal, unquote, from Vanity Fair magazine 2019. So what was Epstein and Junkerman doing in the UK with two U.S. senators in 2002 from his article, quote, Epstein and Junkerman, September 1st, 2002, The Secret Senators and the Wexner War on Iraq, unquote, by Johnny Vedmore.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And a couple names there, Peter Thiel being a big Trump donor and supporter, also being a college speechwriter. Thanks, John Brisson, for bringing this up in an interview with Ed Opperman, college speechwriter for William Bennett, who is part of the committee on the present danger China, which, of course, Bill Bennett being an alumnus of the Reagan end of the Cold War era. And then also you mentioned the name, of course, Alan Dershowitz, but Dershowitz said to his former student and admirer of the Rebbe, Joel Pollack, on Breitbart Radio that, Virginia Roberts Giuffre got him confused with Nathan Myhrvold, the Microsoft executive, and that'll be another topic to visit again with Myhrvold's involvement with Microsoft in Israel, and of course the role of Bill Gates being at the center of a lot of the conspiracy culture-oriented narratives regarding COVID-19. Some legitimate, and some I think to an extent are probably exaggerated. But a couple of more things there that you mentioned that I wanted to allude to.
Well, thank you for nailing down that background of the Joel Pollack where Dershowitz had said this, that it was basically the victims confusing him with Myhrvold, and I would just probably ask the question of whether it was not a either or, that they were probably obviously both involved in this network, this Epstein network. And I think that the Bill Gates connection, and the Nathan Myhrvold, the CTO of Microsoft, right? Okay, who was said to have been the one who really got Bill Gates focused on Israel. This connection to Epstein is crucial, of course, and we'll put it aside for now. But Whitney Webb has been bringing up how there's this article that she found from the scrubbed internet that was published around the turn of the millennium from the British press that basically said that Epstein had it was claimed that Epstein had made his money and fame basically from a relationship with three men, one of them being Donald Trump, another one being Bill Gates, and then the third one I believe being Les Wexner. And so that is quite a combination there. And Bill Gates' central role right now in terms of pushing the solution to our current COVID problem is even more serious, considering this covered up background of him being at the epicenter of the Epstein network. And I would say this covered up relationship of technology, high technology, cyber technology, especially in conjunction with potential genetic information, healthcare information, as it's all potentially tied in backdoor more and more towards something like a hardened Israeli military intelligence objective.
Yes, agreed. And we've kind of gone digressions from our topic, but I hope all of this is useful to the out there for in terms of discussing all this, as it all does seem to interrelate together in a very in a bigger narrative, but ultimately that so many of these things do obviously interweave and intertangle together. And even, of course, Epstein's interesting when it comes to the committee for president on the present danger China, and that one of the top figures in the CPD, probably the guy who seems to be in many ways leading the propaganda war against China at this point, leading the propaganda war going back to the 2015, 20 certainly to coming on to Trump's campaign as the head Trump's campaign in 2016. Of course, Steve Bannon, the former head of Breitbart, conceived in Israel. Having met with Epstein at least 2 times in a period between November of 2016, I believe, the summer of 2018. So there you have even more, possible, probable overlap with these varying entities and individuals and bigger interests that have policies and interests at stake with regards to whatever much bigger game than any of us, I think, really fully comprehend at this point is going on within these high levels of power in our society. And so getting back to the CPD China in this article, the thing I really, when we discussed it at the end of our last show, that I really hammered home was that this whole CPD nest of these people that are in the at the center involved with the CPD China. You could name some of the prominent names. Steve Bannon, one of them. Frank Gaffney is very much is one of the centerpieces of this article for the Nation by Jason Vest on the men from JINSA and CSP. And then also we've talked about General Jerry Boykin, of course. 3 primary examples of big time propagandists when it comes to war on terror, whether it's through national security it's with Gaffney or through media with Bannon and Breitbart, and then Boykin through his varying roles he's had through organizations such as the Family Research Council, and then also as a contributor to varying right-wing media propaganda outlets, that this is a particular strain of hawk that was not always even in line with a lot of the narratives of the Bush administration. Seemed to take much more of a hard line than even a lot of the typical Bush administration people did during the lead up to and then the aftermath of the Iraq War, really pushing hard for what could have been, so it appears to have been perhaps a stood down effort to wage a false flag that could have led to something catastrophic with Iran in 2007, as we talked about on this show previously, and then being the leaders of a lot of the propaganda during the Obama era that depicted Obama as everything from anti-Israel to an apologist for terrorism to, possibly even being himself a radical Muslim communist with illegitimate parents born in Africa or whatever. And now coming around to Trump in a very big way, and that was ignored by a lot of these people who just this whole narrative of Trump being anti-neocon and the neocon Zionists hate Trump, while meanwhile all these people such as the Gaffneys and the Boykins and the Bannons and the Bill Bennetts and whoever else you want to name that's at the forefront of this China propaganda right now, and his number one Fox News mouthpiece for the anti-China hardline taking place right now, Tucker Carlson. They were all with Trump all along and is very much ignored. But I think this article, you see some of these names, it reiterates that. And there's one more name mentioned in this article that of course, we've talked about before, in direct relation to a man who was very close to Trump, that of being his first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, and that's Michael Ledeen. And you found an interesting excerpt. You found a couple excerpts from this article regarding Michael Ledeen. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure. All right. So this, the men from JINSA and CSP. I'll skip the intro to it, as it just talks about the background of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the Center for Security Policy, CSP, and how dozens of their members have ascended to powerful government posts, and how during the and here's interesting. I'll just start right here, that where their quote, where their advocacy in support of the same agenda continues, abetted by the out of government adjuncts from which they came. Industrious and persistent, they've managed to weave a number of issues: support for national missile defense, opposition to arms control treaties, championing of wasteful weapon systems, arms aid to Turkey, and American unilateralism in general into a hard line with support for the Israeli right at its core. On no issue is the JINSA CSP hardline more evident than in its relentless campaign for war, not just with Iraq, but quote-unquote total war, as Michael Ledeen, one of the most influential JINSANs in Washington, put it last year. For this crew, quote, regime change, unquote, by any means necessary in Iraq, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and the Palestinian Authority is an urgent imperative. Anyone who dissents, be it Colin Powell's State Department, the CIA, or career military officers, is committing heresy against articles of faith that effectively hold that there is no difference between U.S. and Israeli national security interests, right? Remember the Wexner wager, trying to figure out how to sell it as a U.S. national interest war. Back to the article, and quote, that the only way to assure continued safety and prosperity for both countries is through hegemony in the Middle East, a hegemony achieved with the traditional Cold War recipe of feints, force, clientism, and covert action. And then one last paragraph here. Quote, for example, the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, chaired by JINSA CSP advisor and former Reagan administration Defense Department official Richard Perle, and stacked with advisors from both groups, recently made news by listening to a briefing that casts Saudi Arabia as an enemy to be brought to heel through a number of potential mechanisms, many of which mirror JINSA's recommendations and which reflect the JINSA CSP crowd's preoccupation with Egypt. The final slide of the Defense Policy Board presentation proposed that, quote, grand strategy for the Middle East, unquote, should concentrate on, quote, Iraq as the tactical pivot, Saudi Arabia as the strategic pivot, and Egypt as the prize, unquote. Ledeen has been leading the charge for regime change in Iran, while old comrades like Andrew Marshall and Harold Rody in the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment actively tinker with ways to re-engineer both the Iranian and Saudi governments. JINSA is also cheering the U.S. military on as it tries to secure basing rights in the strategic Red Sea country of Eritrea, happily failing to mention that the once promising secular regime of President Isaias Afewerki continues to slide into the kind of repressive authoritarianism practiced by the quote-unquote axis of evil and its adjuncts. Okay, I can stop there. There's one more paragraph that deals with the Center for National Policy and I believe the Hudson Institute, but let's leave it there for now. And I did find some interesting aspects about Perle and Harold Rody in relationship to this whole episode in The Prince of Darkness, Richard Perle, The Kingdom, the Power, and the End of Empire in America by Alan Weissman. But I'll leave it up to you, Greg, if you want to move on now or have me read a little bit from that.
You can read a little bit from that if you want to. And the reason why I brought up once again to reiterate on Ledeen is like I think the epitome of this what we've identified as this neocon split between like some of the who we've identified as the never Trumpers, the Bill Kristols and David Frums and people like that who are, want a strong America with like kind of a strong military combined with strong, say, more neoliberal economic global hegemony and the idea of democracy and all this and that, who are very sensitive about looking like they're too openly in terms of like openly hawkish, not only against enemies in terms of countries such as Iraq or entities, but also in regimes, but even more so racially and culturally, whereas the Ledeens, who co-wrote a book with Michael Ledeen co-wrote a book with Michael Flynn about winning the war on terrorism, really making no bones about how we depict this. If we are going to depict this as a war against an entire culture, an entire civilization, no big deal to these people. So that's it. With Ledeen, I just zeroed in on that again because even though Ledeen, from a propaganda perspective, I'm sure he said some things about China. He's forefront right now in terms of the present rhetoric, and neither is Michael Flynn, who's kind of he's kind of looking for his pardon from President Trump right now, it looks like, and he's been kind of out of the spotlight as of late outside of his trial. But it's still very much, these two are very much interconnected to this CPD style network of operatives and even getting into just the entire bigger picture of propaganda outlets that are pushing this narrative with the Washington Times and Council for National Policy and all of the varying tentacles of those networks. So that's why bringing up Ledeen there, I just wanted to mention him again as being at the forefront of this through a Trump, very close Trump associate ally, that being Michael Flynn, who happened to push some of the most hardline war on terror rhetoric from an American would be close administration official we've heard in quite some time. So
it's a good point, because especially I think that the parallel analysis for this moment is crucial in relationship to the way that these same individuals were pitching the quote-unquote war on terror as a civilizational struggle, right? And of course, a lot of this emanates in terms of academic policy out of like Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, the pitching of an inevitable future as basically a clash amongst global civilizations of some sort. And so to see these same kind of guys basically take on what's actually been exposed at some level about there's a certain brittleness in relationship to the where we've allowed our civilization to come to in relationship to economics and politics, and where it is obviously sort of failing to serve us in the midst of our a crisis in relationship to pandemic time. And so in the midst of all of that, then the same rhetoric comes back out that there is the evil enemy that can be located, and that they are the focus, the whole focus of the Chinese civilization is basically, and government, and of course this goes back to your very crucial analysis, Greg, about how these paleo neocons and some of these sort of guys that we're talking about here seem to sort of play the line between the paleo neocons like the Crystals and the Kagans, who would always try to put it in the terms of this is not a civilizational struggle. This is against, a specific small group of people who are trying to destroy the world, really, right? If you're taking the Crystal Kagan line at some level, and that would be sort of similar to what some of these people are saying about China. It's not China as an entire country or all its people or a civilization. It's just the CCP, but what's actually operating underneath that is these more extreme neocons, or these neo-neocons, who actually do not only believe but actually use the rhetorical device that this is a clash of civilizations that has to be addressed. And of course, that's what all of the bantering about the question of calling it what it is was during the Obama administration. And who was at the epicenter of all of that? Michael Flynn. You can't defeat the enemy unless you call it what it is: radical Islamic extremism.
And I'd throw out the name probably not as influential as Flynn, but I'd also throw the name Tulsi Gabbard out there as well.
Well, that's a key recognition of how this plays right across the horseshoe and across different in different spheres, especially that's sort of like the progressive. Tulsi Gabbard was very influential in shaping especially the alternative media landscape during her, especially over the last year in terms of her run, whether for everyone from sort of the Sputnik types over to the Jimmy Dore types, she was heavily influential. And so I think that's a great point, Greg. All right, so let me get into this book, just a few pages of the book, Prince of Darkness about Richard Perle, The Kingdom, the Power, and the End of Empire in America by Alan Weissman. The chapter, The Bayou Tapestry, page 167. Quote, if indeed Perle and the board had not been fixated on Iraq, I think the board is referencing to the Defense Policy Board, had not been fixated on Iraq before the meeting, they certainly were afterward. Just one day later, many of the attendees, including Perle, wearing their PNAC hats again, Project for a New American Century, signed an open letter to President Bush calling for the removal of Saddam, quote, even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attack, unquote. The letter goes on to warn, quote, failure to undertake such an effort will constitute an early and perhaps decisive surrender in the war on international terrorism, unquote. Bush is reported to have rejected the proposal because Cheney and Powell agreed there was no evidence so far linking Saddam to the attack. But that problem would be fixed soon enough. Right after the DPB, Defense Policy Board, meeting, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz dispatched Jim Woolsey to London. right? Jim Woolsey, there he is, reportedly to meet with the INC, I believe that's the Iraqi National Congress, and troll for any information linking one of the hijackers, Mohammed Atta, to Iraqi intelligence. Asked about this, Woolsey replied, quote, "I've never talked about that. I was asked by the Defense Department and the Justice Department to accompany an official from each organization to talk with the Brits and share information. Richard could conceivably have suggested it," unquote. When police in Wales spotted Woolsey, they phoned the U.S. Embassy to make sure he was on official government business. It was only then that Colin Powell and CIA Director George Tenet learned of Woolsey's trip. Larry Wilkerson said, that's fairly stunning. This is like the former head of the CIA going on a terror cell attachment, based on the Pentagon, OSP, ONI, that's coordinating with highest levels of Israeli intelligence, and the former director of the CIA is going on a side mission here, if this is to be believed, where the then current head of the CIA and then current head of the State Department didn't know that was going on. Okay, back to the text. Quote, Larry Wilkerson said the general became so angry about state being responsible for Chalabi and his gang that either Powell or his deputy, Richard Armitage, finally told Wolfowitz, quote, "You want them, you got them. You want the INC, we're sick of them. They spend money, they drive Mercedes, they stay in expensive hotels, and they don't do shit except spend our money," unquote. Responsibility for the INC was transferred from state to the DIA, but Wilkerson still fumes at the memories. Quote, "We wanted out of that business, so finally we said, take the money and everything," unquote. All right, one last little bit here I want to read very quickly, and then you can move us on, Greg. But I just wanted to mention that in terms of the Chalabi connection, the Iraqi National Congress, and especially with what's going on with the obvious Trump, for the Trump's pump and dump operation in relationship to Wall Street, in suppression, really, of Main Street, who's in charge? Of course, Steve Mnuchin. Right, and Steve Mnuchin on TV talking about the $12,000, maybe with an extra $600 for unemployment for those who can get it, to last Americans 10 weeks during this thing, while Wall Street is getting everything that it wants. And who was one of Steve Mnuchin's college roommates when he was at Yale? I think i.e. Skull and Bones, second generation, I think, Skull and Bones at Yale. Steve Mnuchin was Chalabi's nephew, who was the go-to asset of this network. Okay, so I think it's interesting. So all right, I'll finish this up. Page 168 of Prince of Darkness about Richard Perle by Alan Weissman. Quote, "Meanwhile, Wolfowitz had ordered Doug Feith to begin an operation that was more than an echo of the old Team B, a quote-unquote review of all data from the intelligence community, especially the CIA, ostensibly to determine whether any links had been missed. Although the names of the various offices and panels either created or assigned to the intelligence review are the subject of some debate, with Feith insisting that Seymour Hersh, quote, got it all balled up, unquote, in Hersh's New Yorker story on the operation. What is clear is that even before the attacks, in fact, even before his confirmation as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Doug Feith was making sure his office contained true believers only. He recruited Harold Rody, in January of 2001, ostensibly to work in the Office of Net Assessment, then run by a Pentagon legend named Andy Marshall, but that assignment appeared to be a cover. Marshall, another Rand offspring known as quote-unquote Yoda within the DoD, lived in a high-tech world of RMA, or Revolution in Military Affairs, a theory first suggested by Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff in 1982, that holds that technological advances eventually will make ground troops unnecessary, as conflicts will be decided by computers and smart weapons. This theory played heavily into the Rumsfeld view that a relatively small number of troops would be required to take and hold Iraq. Harold Rody, whose expertise was the study of the Ottomans, would not have known which end was up in Andy Marshall's office. His real impact was ferreting out personnel who did not share his or Feith's view. Rhodey was seen as Fithe's hatchet man, purging career defense officials who would not get on board for the Target Iraq mission, quote, pulling people out of nooks and crannies at the Defense Intelligence Agency, unquote, according to one analyst. Quote, Fife and Rhodey, wanted nothing to do with the professional staff. They wanted us the fuck out of there, unquote. Fife and Rhodey recruited David Wormser, the Clean Break author, to run the intelligence review, and he in turn was teamed with a technocrat named Michael Maloof, who had worked for Perle at the Pentagon in the 1980s and had previously been monitoring technology transfers to China. Perle denies having played a role in the staffing of the operation, but acknowledges that it was more than serendipity that the major players had all worked for him in the past. Okay, I'll stop there, but then the next part goes into Abe Shulsky, a Straussian scholar, Rand man, the Office of Special Plans, and we've dealt with that in previous antidotes.
I remember Shulsky was it was Shulsky who was mentioned by the director of the film on Catherine Gunn that made Phyllis Bennis of Institute for Policy Studies kind of visibly uncomfortable during the Q&A panel we were at for the screening of that documentary. It's kind of
that's a good point. It wasn't a documentary; it was a
it was actual film.
Yeah.
And then going back, just one more thing, but with a couple of the names you mentioned there, I would add the key names that you mentioned in those excerpts were, of course, Richard Perle, who that book is about. Actually, of course, Perle being at the center of an entire nest, it seems, going back at least to the top right hand man of Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, who was one of the first neocons, meaning a former Democrat, to go over to really push the hawkish, to leave the Democrats because they weren't hawkish enough in terms of fighting the Cold War and against America's quote unquote enemies, real and perceived. Perle being a seminal figure in our modern history, and then also Douglas Feith and David Wormser. And these people have been very, very quiet in the age of Trump. You don't hear much from them at all. I mean, David Wormser, the news on Wormser in the Trump era that I've seen is limited to him being in contact with Newt Gingrich about the need to get Obama era holdovers out of then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's State Department. So that's about that's about what you've heard from Wormser. And these people have very much been quiet in the age of Trump. I mean, you can find a couple of Richard Perle interviews, I think, on Newsmax TV, but there's not too much outside of that. So that's interesting. They still remain in the shadows, and they really haven't been discussed much in the age of Trump. And so I think, continue to kind of have a microscope at some level on these people. And then also, of course, Michael Maloof, who we played a clip from about a year ago of him on RT with in an unfortunate clip with Philip Giraldi, where Giraldi just kind of sits by and nods his head while Maloof blames the CIA and the faulty intel, meaning the deep state, for the Iraq war, basically the same deep state that's trying to destroy Trump with this whole Russia thing. That was we talked about that a while back, and that
it was the Democrat deep state that had tried to undermine W. Bush. You're right. It was very unfortunate.
A variation of what Rush Limbaugh would go on to say a couple months ago that I broke down in an audio about back in late February, beginning of March. So you still have this network out there of people that's still that needs to have a microscope on them. Of course, Michael Maloof, we've talked and discussed him in depth, is a very interesting person, going from being a primary member of the or close associate of the OSP, the Office of Special Plans, and the Perle Feith contingent, but also then going on to WorldNet Daily and now to RT, of course. And one more thing about Maloof, two more things we'll reiterate. Judith Miller, according to Franklin Foer, being the primary source for Judith Miller in the lead up to the Iraq War, and her role as primary propagandist in the New York Times. And then also you mentioned Maloof being involved in terms of overseeing in a role of almost like an overseer of U.S. technology to China. It almost sounded like that's what you said with relation to Maloof. But Maloof being involved with that with China, we go back to WND, which has been a primary purveyor going back to the Clinton era, WorldNet Daily, of pushing a lot of the rhetoric you're seeing today on China. It was simply in the context of Clinton betraying America and selling us out to China, of course, leaving out the Israeli aspect and other aspects as well. So Maloof might be an interesting person to look at in terms of a split that we keep hearing about within elements of the alternative media regarding China partisans and Russia partisans. Although I think at the end of the day, there's a kind of a coming together in certain areas when it comes to the multipolarity, and certainly seeing the U.S. kind of removed as like the world's leading power and authority on so many of these things. But it's interesting in that context of a possible China-Russia split as well in various areas of policy, where you see so many of these people who are at the forefront of defending Trump over the Russia investigation now being at the forefront of pushing the really hawkish, at least rhetorically speaking, against China. So, all right, and so I guess we're going to move on now. Jeremy, still there?
Yeah, still here.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
I'm on mute. I had the
Oh,
mute.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. I wasn't sure if you were going to say anything, if you were going to comment or not. But
Yeah,
I guess
I would say something, but we don't have much time, and I wanted to make sure we made some time for what you
oh
wanted
well.
to do.
I mean, if you had a quick comment, if you don't want, okay, that's cool. I wanted to move on into something we alluded to this at the beginning of the show, and that relating to Jeffrey Epstein in a recent interview that Whitney Webb has published excerpts from with a woman by the name of Maria Farmer, who appears as one of the very first whistleblowers against Jeffrey Epstein. And I think the most interesting part of her of what Maria Farmer's had to say, that come out and say, is that she was going to virtually all of the major media outlets, publications, and has been blowing the whistle about Jeffrey Epstein going back to the late '90s. And she, in this interview with Whitney Webb, very interestingly pointed at Vicky Ward, the would-be heroic journalist at Vanity Fair, who was writing about Epstein going all the way back to 2003, and Vicky Ward's been portrayed as kind of like a hero of the Epstein Chronicles as far as exposing things. But Maria Farmer's alleged that Vicky Ward had regularly harassed her over the years, and among other things, and also even in an exchange with our friend Chris Rulon on Twitter, Vicky Ward told him that James Patterson had also been harassing Maria Farmer. And of course, James Patterson was the writer of a book, I believe is titled Filthy Rich, about Epstein, where I believe the most mainstream source for the claim that Donald Trump had kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago and refused to work with him. Of course, Patterson being a former Mar-a-Lago member himself, who is close friends with Bill Clinton, written books with Bill Clinton, but also it appears, if this is true, would have a vested interest in possibly even defending, running cover for a Trump angle with relation to Epstein. So that was very interesting. And once again, we applaud Whitney Webb for the very important work she's doing in this time. We hope she's staying safe down there in Chile with the stuff she's coming out with. But these excerpts from this Maria Farmer interview, it's pretty interesting for a lot of reasons. One, in being that you never know who your allies and friends are. I mean, it's people who are presented to be heroes in varying narratives, but also just if this is true, and I have no reason. If all this is true regarding Patterson and Vicky Ward and their behavior, I mean, it's just a really particularly, I think, it really sheds light on something that is particularly nasty, and that in the case of Vicky Ward, a would-be whistleblower was actually treating real whistleblowers in this manner. I mean, that's pretty disgusting if it's true.
Oh, yeah. And it's hard data of what we sort of, those of us who pay attention somewhat to the media landscape know, is that the front line of so-called journalism, especially around these deep politics, issues of the deep state, right? These kinds of issues, the Jeffrey Epstein network, obviously are not just playing a role as reporters. If they're even doing that, they're actually primarily playing the role of some type of intelligence network. And that would include not only the informational angle, which would include suppressing certain information. For example, Wexner, that's what Maria Farmer's been reporting to Whitney Webb, is that every time that she was dealing with mainstream media, Wexner was where the red line was. And that's what would never make it. And that's what we're still seeing. There's still an emphasis on the cover-up around Wexner, and Wexner's PR is going hardcore. I mean, and that, of course, then moves into the whole Wexner network, which includes the entire sort of new anti-Semitism network into how it operates in the United States. And that includes people like Deborah Lipstadt, who was even, on her book tour of the new anti-Semitism and talking about it, and the local Jewish Federation in Kansas City, in conjunction with the local public college, the University of Missouri Kansas City, sponsored her talk there. And that she's a long-term Wexner fellow. Okay, so what we're seeing is that these so-called journalists on the front lines of supposedly reporting these really deep, important stories are not only acting to limit information, but they're actually acting as almost like covert intelligence operatives, where they're working to suppress and threaten individual victims of these operations, right? So that's someone who's not just covering up information. That's someone who's actually involved in the harassment of an individual. And so it shows you how much rot there is in relationship to not only the justice system, obviously, because that was another thing that Maria Farmer was telling Whitney Webb, was about the FBI's role in knowing all of this, sitting on it, helping basically secure the cover-up at some level, at the very least in terms of the top-down, but also the justice system in terms of the judges. And very recently, a judge finding that the victims did not have standing anymore, and that the agreement that had been made by Acosta really held in relationship to every other member of this network who'd been involved in the victimization of hundreds, if not thousands, of girls. And Maria Farmer makes serious allegations about girls who are now gone, and no one can account for them. And where are they? And when we think back about the question of Maria, the other Maria story in relationship to the 2016 election campaign, and Epstein and Trump being accused of basically threatening her life, you begin to wonder how dark and how violent and how horrible this is. And of course, as we pointed out, if this Wexner network was conspiring to orchestrate a mass war crime that was going to end up getting hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Iraqi lives destroyed, let alone the dozens of thousands of American soldiers' lives that have been destroyed in many such ways, such as whether they've been killed, casualties in the acts of war, or if they come home and then take their lives, like we've seen basically probably over 100,000 American veterans take their lives in the wake of these unjust, dirty Leslie Wexner network wars. Of course, the lives of a few sort of girls that they think are sort of an underclass of humans. That's part of it too. There's a supremacist eugenics angle to that network. Epstein, Maxwell, Wexner, a Judeo-supremacism, it looks like. And, if they think, that millions of lives are not worth anything, then, a few hundred lives of these girls who they see as sort of an underclass, that's nothing. That's basically, a toenail on an elephant to them. So I just, there's this really, really deep things that we need to deal with that have still not been dealt with in terms of this Epstein network.
Yes, and there's so much to unpeel, and I mean, you can never run out of time. You can never we talk about this literally forever and still never come anywhere close to all of us who are kind of in this kind of research could collectively talk about this for spend all of our time talking about this and not get not uncover or even delve into every single layer of this, just how far it goes. So I mean, that's just all we can do at this time, is just really keep soldiering along and finding new information as it goes along, and then just trying to bring it out as best we can. I mean, that's kind of what we can do right now. So we really commend Whitney for putting herself at the front lines of this with I would say her work over the last year or so in particular has been some of the most important, I'd say, work, journalistic work from, I would put, it's just such vital work. And so we're glad for her and for other people who may not even be getting the accolades she's getting. They're also out there putting this kind of work out there. And just,
yeah. And meanwhile, her work as the leading sort of journalist analyst of the newest 9/11, i.e. 3/11, the whole COVID-19 pandemic, she's still leading the way on that in terms of the question of the so-called response to it, the biological, taking advantage of all this, whether it's the surveillance or the questions of who's going to be able to enact the alleged vaccines that are alleged to be coming. So all of that work, it continues to go on. So pay attention to her work. Yes,
it's kind of, I would say it has done somewhat of a service in terms of bringing together where the varying conspiracy narratives kind of go. Whereas on one hand, it's the blaming of China, but on the other hand, also bringing in, say, Bill Gates and the World Health Organization, but also bringing in this very particular strain that we were talking about earlier of this committee on the present danger, China with the Bush era hawks and Cold Warrior hawks all mobilizing around this particular threat, but kind of bringing these together. Whereas you can see that, well, it's not just that, and it's not just these hardline hawks, and it's not just this Bill Gates, World Health Organization, whatever globalist elite type of narratives being put out there. But the truth most likely appears on a lot of this to be somewhere in the middle, where you have all of these entities playing a role. But it's also important to get through the propaganda and through the exaggerated talking points, which I've seen are mostly seen to be coming from this very conspiracy-oriented media, InfoWars-style media operations that just make everything out, just throw in any type of perceived left type of entity as being automatically culpable in these kind of operations. So, getting through the propaganda and through the exaggerations of things, and also through some of the ideological boxes, and trying to go into the middle and trying to find where some of these truths are about these Bill Gates style entities, but also not getting into the hyperbole that we see in so many forms of media. I mean, that's a trick, but it's something that I think needs to be done. So
I agree. Our last, we have 2 minutes here, Greg. Do you want to just give a taste of what you've been thinking about in terms of how, thinking about speaking to friends and family about issues?
Yeah, I'd like to, because lately I've been since I've been my job, I've been laid off, or I'm not at my job currently because of the COVID-19 crisis. I've actually been doing a lot of. My mom is an Instacart deliverer, grocery deliverer, and I've been working with her. Going 4 or 5 days a week, helping her with that, particularly with orders where there's a lot of lifting and a lot of items where you have to lift and take into people's houses. And I've been working with her, and she's been very much too much into this conservative. And Mom, if you by chance happen to fall upon this and listen to this, I love you. I'm thinking about you. But she's fallen into this very reactionary conservative Fox News, Rush Limbaugh pro-Trump sphere. And I'm kind of right now there's a bit of a dilemma where I'm trying to rationalize this, knowing what these people represent and just the lies and propaganda they've promoted over the years and continue to promote now in the age of Trump, and trying to reconcile that and expressing these disagreements and obvious differences in a manner that does not result in just arguments and hurt feelings, but in a way that it can actually be done in a constructive manner. And I think that's something a lot of us can relate to, family members who we disagree with politically, and it's something we can all have a conversation about. And I think I'd like to explore this topic in the future, and just ways that we can have these dialogues in a respectful and meaningful manner, rather than just delving into arguments and insults and all this and that, which I've been tempted to do at various times.
Well, I love that you want to bring this up, Greg, and let's make sure that we do deal with this, because it's a very important topic. Is how do we have conversations with each other, especially with people we love who we disagree with intensely, and then how do we have effective moral and political speech across boundaries ultimately, and work to enliven each other's minds and hearts in a way that's compassionate. So I guess until next week. Antidote, we out.
All right, we'll be back soon.